If they stayed in one place, they died. Not eventually. Not after a season of struggle or a winter of rationing. Immediately. Fatally. With no warning and no second chance. The moment a group on the Eurasian steppe stopped reading the signals around them and trusted that staying put was safe, the landscape consumed them. That is not a metaphor. That is the operational reality of one of the most demanding survival environments in human history. 40,000 years before Rome was an idea, before the first brick was laid, before any human drew a border and called it home, people were surviving across one of the largest land masses on Earth, open grassland, stretching from Eastern Europe deep into Mongolia, without a single permanent structure. No storage, no walls, no shelter we would recognize today. Not just surviving, thriving. Passing knowledge across thousands of years without a single city, without a single written record, without any of the fixed infrastructure we now assume is the foundation of advanced civilization. The Eurasian steppe covers roughly 8 million square kilometers. For most of human prehistory, it hosted one of the most sophisticated survival systems ever built. Not sophisticated the way a machine is, but sophisticated the way a predator is. Precise, efficient, unforgiving of error, and built entirely from knowledge that lived inside human minds. This is that story. To understand the steppe, you have to understand what it actually is, because it is not what it looks like. From a satellite image, it looks like nothing. An ocean of grass from horizon to horizon. Flat, featureless, empty. But that is wrong. The steppe is a biological engine in constant motion, where grass grows in pulses, rivers flood and dry in shifting patterns, and herds of bison, wild horses, and reindeer move like weather systems across thousands of kilometers. Grass grows in pulses, not steadily, not evenly, but in surges triggered by specific combinations of temperature, soil, moisture, and wind exposure. A ridge that looks dead in late spring can erupt into dense grazing territory within 2 weeks of the right rainfall. A valley that supported a massive herd for 3 consecutive seasons can suddenly dry into hardpan the following year, offering nothing. The landscape does not hold still. It breathes, it shifts, it reorganizes itself on timelines that look random from the outside but follow patterns readable from within if you know what you are looking for. Rivers on the steppe swell and retreat dramatically, with snowmelt cycles from mountain ranges hundreds of kilometers away. A crossing passable in early autumn can become a kilometer-wide torrent 6 weeks later. Water sources that appear reliable operate on schedules that shift year to year. A pool that held water through August for the past decade might dry by mid-July this year. If your group depends on that pool, and you have not already identified the next viable water source, you do not have a problem. You have a crisis. And moving through all of this, defining its rhythms, more than anything else, are the herds. Bison, wild horses, reindeer, saiga, antelope in numbers genuinely difficult to visualize from a modern context. Herds of tens of thousands of animals following migration corridors, established over generations. A valley full of life could turn empty in hours, not because the animals were fleeing, but because the herd had simply moved on, following signals in the grass and wind that humans had learned to read alongside them. Staying still in this environment is not stability, it is exposure, because everything you need, food, water, thermal cover, is already in the process of leaving. Early humans on the steppe did not chase resources. That is the critical distinction, and it is the thing that makes the entire system work. What they built over tens of thousands of years, refined across generations through a process of absolute elimination, was an interception system. They were not tracking where animals were. They were predicting where animals would be. This is a different cognitive operation entirely. Tracking is reactive. You follow a trail, observe direction and speed, attempt to close the distance. Tracking is what you do when you are already behind. On the steppe, being behind meant arriving after the density peak had passed, after the margin between adequate food and not enough had already closed. Being behind, even by a day, could mean the difference between a group that eats and a group that begins dying. Prediction meant something else. Large herbivores followed grass cycles driven by temperature and rainfall. Temperature and rainfall responded to broader atmospheric patterns that expressed themselves in observable signals: shifts in wind direction, changes in cloud formation, the specific way certain grasses bent and dried in the days following a rain event. Animal tracks along established migration corridors did not just tell you where the herd had been, they told you, if you knew how to read them correctly, whether the corridor was running early or late this year. A child raised in this system did not learn these things through formal instruction. They learned by being inside the system continuously, observing it across seasons and years, having specific observations interpreted by adults who had been watching the same patterns for decades. By the time a young person was old enough to contribute to group decisions, they had accumulated thousands of hours of direct environmental observation, layered over inherited pattern recognition, extending back generations. The result, the ability to position a group not where the herd was, but where the density would peak, sometimes 2 or 3 days before the first animal arrived. Arrive early, and you eat. Arrive late, and there is nothing. Miss the herd by 1 day, and your group doesn't get hungry. It doesn't start rationing. It vanishes. Because on the steppe, there is no fallback. There is no secondary food source waiting nearby. There is no storage to draw down while you recalculate. There is only the next corridor, which may be days of travel away, which may have already peaked. Miss one window, and the sequence of consequences closes around a group faster than it can recover. Prediction alone could not keep you alive, because movement itself is expensive. Energy on the steppe is acquired in bursts and lost rapidly through cold and exertion. So the system evolved around selective movement groups, held position as long as the local system supported them, then relocated the moment it demanded. Move too early, and you exhaust your group chasing nothing. Move too late, and the corridor closes. Stay too long, and the ecosystem collapses beneath you in days. Not gradually, not with warnings that build slowly into an unmistakable signal. The window opens, it closes. Whether you are inside it depends entirely on whether your timing was correct. This is why steppe humans could not accumulate anything. Not because they lacked the ingenuity, but because accumulation in any physical form was a cause of death. Storage containers add weight. Weight reduces movement speed. Reduced speed means missing the next corridor in time. The logic is that simple and that brutal. Tools had to be minimal and repairable in the field, not given access to a workshop, but with materials available in the immediate environment, in the time available before the group needed to move. Clothing was a complete thermal management system that replaced permanent shelter in environments dropping to -30 degrees Celsius. Fire was used and abandoned. Food storage meant staying in place, and staying meant missing the next movement window. The selection pressure worked in one direction only, toward lightness. Any object, any habit, any attachment to a fixed location was not just inconvenient, it was a cause of death. Applied for tens of thousands of years, that pressure produced a culture of radical efficiency with no parallel on Earth and cognitive capabilities that our infrastructure-rich modern world has largely allowed to atrophy. Without permanent settlements, survival shifted from physical infrastructure to cognitive infrastructure. Memory became the primary storage medium, deep, multi-generational memory that encoded the landscape itself as a navigational document. Certain river crossings were viable only within a window as narrow as 10 days. Certain ridgelines sheltered from predictable autumn winds that could drop the effective temperature by 15 degrees in under an hour. Certain depressions held water weeks after rainfall had ended everywhere else, not because of surface accumulation, but because of subsurface geology that created slow seepage from below. None of this was written down. It was transmitted through language and experience, layered so deeply that a child carried hundreds of kilometers of terrain in their memory before they were old enough to lead a group. A misremembered river crossing, A seasonal timing recollected 1 week off. A water source recalled with a spatial error that sent your search into the wrong drainage. These were not inconveniences. They were potentially fatal. The precision with which knowledge was transmitted was not academic. It was the difference between a group that survived the season and a group that did not. The landscape was not a place they lived. It was a document they read. That attention had to extend outward, because the steppe system depended on forces no human could control. Rainfall patterns shifted without warning. Temperature swings altered grass growth by weeks. Animal migrations that followed the same corridor for a decade could suddenly deflect 40 kilometers, driven by drought in a distant region, leaving groups positioned perfectly for the expected migration, standing in an empty corridor with no food, no fallback, and a movement emergency developing in real time. Early humans were not in control of any of this. They were aligned with it. Control means you dictate the terms. Alignment means you read them accurately enough to stay inside them and act on that reading before certainty arrived, because hesitation on the steppe was itself a fatal decision. When that alignment broke down, the consequences were not gradual. A herd shifting its migration corridor by 40 kilometers did not produce less food. It produced none. A water source drying 2 weeks early did not create a rationing problem. It created a movement emergency. The steppe did not offer the kind of hardship that allows for adaptation and recovery. It did not turn the dial down slowly while humans adjusted. It offered a cliff edge, and the cliff edge did not look like a cliff edge until you were already past it. The steppe did not punish mistakes, it erased them. Groups that misread signals stopped existing. Groups that moved too slowly stopped existing. Groups that trusted a pattern that had already shifted stopped existing, not always dramatically, not always rapidly, but absolutely. There was no partial failure. There was no lesson learned from a near miss that you carried forward. There was survival, or there was not. Over tens of thousands of years, that elimination shaped something deeper than learned behavior. It shaped the cognitive profile of the people who remained. Pattern recognition refined to a precision that allowed prediction days in advance of events. Timing sensitivity that registered meaningful signals weeks before they became obvious. The ability to act before certainty arrived, to trust a reading, and commit to it in the full knowledge that waiting for confirmation was itself a death sentence. These were not personality traits. They were survival traits, forged by a landscape with no tolerance for error. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, something changed, and it changed everything. People began to build, not temporarily, but permanently. They planted, stored food, constructed walls that resisted the environment rather than aligned with it. Agriculture was not an evolution of the steppe system. It was its philosophical opposite. Where the steppe was built on mobility and acceptance of impermanence, agriculture was built on fixity, the assertion that one place could sustain life indefinitely. That assertion built the world we live in now. But every choice has a cost. The cost of agriculture was the systematic dismantling of everything that made the steppe system work. Written records replaced multi-generational memory. Maps replaced embodied spatial knowledge. Calendars replaced direct environmental reading. The skills maintained by absolute selection pressure skills, where the failure mode was group extinction, were replaced by infrastructure that performed the same functions with less cognitive demand. Which is rational, which is, in almost every practical sense, better. But efficient replacement is still replacement. The skills did not go dormant, waiting to be reactivated. They were selected against, generation by generation, as the infrastructure that replaced them became more reliable. The attention to environmental signals that had been the survival imperative for tens of thousands of years became irrelevant. And what is irrelevant, in a species as adaptable as ours, tends to disappear. What remains of that system exists mostly as an absence, a gap in our cognitive vocabulary we rarely notice until the systems around us begin to show stress. We are surrounded by infrastructure designed to eliminate the exact skills those early humans spent 40,000 years perfecting. reading signals before they become crises, moving before stability becomes a trap, carrying less and knowing more. Real-time data systems eliminate the need to read environmental signals early. Supply chains eliminate the need to position before the peak. Warning systems eliminate the need to act before certainty arrives. But infrastructure is not the same as capability. Infrastructure performs functions in normal conditions. Capability is the underlying ability to perform those functions when the infrastructure is unavailable, when the conditions it was designed for no longer apply. The step raises a question that is not historical, it is immediate. If the infrastructure civilization rests upon began to break down in ways that staying in place could not fix, would we recognize the signals in time? Would we see the early indicators of a pattern shift before it became a crisis? Would we have the willingness to act before certainty arrived, the things the step developed and modernity quietly discarded? Or would we do what the step eliminated? Wait for certainty, hold position, trust that the pattern we have always known will return? On the step, that was the last mistake you made. The window opened. It closed. What mattered was not whether you understood, in retrospect, what had happened. What mattered was whether you had moved. Subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. The oldest answers are buried under everything we call progress.